5. Jesus said at the Last Supper, I long to share this with you. I wish I could say I've been longing to share this with you, but sadly that's not necessarily the case. Some of you know, before I came into the Catholic Church, I worked in the field of mental health for many years. And I think it's for that reason that after I was ordained, well, before I even begun parish work, I got a call from Becca saying, the Vicar General wants to see you. But don't worry, it's nothing bad. I haven't even started work yet. And he could ask me to begin a chapter of Courage, the national and international apostolate, Catholic apostolate for people with same-sex attraction. You can only think it's because of my clinical background that I don't have any particular expertise in same-sex matters or anything like that. But it has been interesting. So what I have to say this morning is partly from my clinical days, partly from my public health days, partly emerging out of my experience with our Courage group, and partly coming out from my own parish experience. So no PowerPoints, no slides, no graphics. I recommend some videos on the last page, but no videos. Very, very low-tech presentation. We can't have gotten away from the term about fake news and fake science, and especially Democrats accusing Republicans of cutting themselves off from the science and formulating policy. So I want to start with the science involved here in same-sex and gender identity issues. And happily for me, my need was anticipated a year ago with the publication of this monograph, which is the first citation on the handout here. Sexuality and Gender, Findings from the Biological, Psychological, and Social Sciences. This was written, it's a review of the literature in, as it says, biological, psychological, and social sciences about same-sex attraction, about gender identity issues. Written by two men with platinum-plated credentials. Lawrence Mayer, the first author, is an epidemiologist and a psychiatrist on the faculty at Johns Hopkins. Paul McHugh, in full disclosure, I should say, I studied with Paul McHugh. I think he's a great man. Retired now, former chairman of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, former head of the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Arguably one of the 2 or 3 most important American psychiatrists of the last 100 years. Credentials don't come any better than these guys. And yet, when this was published, it caused a bit of a firestorm in the progressive thinking component of the population, because what they say is, I quote the line, "This report shows that some of the most frequently heard claims about sexuality and gender are not supported by scientific evidence." This is a really useful book, but it was criticized immediately. The criticisms were almost universally ad hominem. These guys are not part of the guild of sex researchers. These guys, they published, it's not a medical journal. Very little engagement with the substance, which is kind of symptomatic of a larger problem here. What they say, and you can download this for free on the New Atlantis website, or you can be like me and spring for a hard copy. What they say is they go carefully through study after study after study after study, and what they find is there's no evidence of an innate disposition to same-sex attraction or an innate difficulty in gender identity, innate confusion in gender identity. but there's no clear-cut source, a biological or psychological source for these matters either. It's carefully chosen here, the wording says, it's not supported by scientific evidence. The notion that we were born this way is not refuted either by the science. And one of my, an STL student at Sacred Heart Seminary, Eduardo Montemayor for my fellow Sacred Heart alums, really got annoyed with me because he was very strident, that there is no scientific basis for this stuff. Well, no, Eduardo, there's no conclusive scientific evidence, but there's not no evidence. So we got to be careful about how you say this. There is some evidence about some genetic components to the emergence of homosexuality. There are some theories about in utero environmental exposures that predispose towards same-sex attraction, but none of these are conclusive. In epidemiological studies, the gold standard is identical twins reared apart, because they have the same set of genes. So if there's a difference in how they develop, it's got to be because of the environment. So identical twins reared apart, in fact, have a higher concordance of homosexuality than the general population, but far from 100%, which suggests, like these guys find in their review of the literature, that there is some genetic connection, but it's not conclusive, it's not definitive, we can't even identify, there's no single gay gene, there's a bunch of genes that are implicated. In other words, it's complicated. Complicated doesn't sell when you're trying to make policy. What sells when you're trying to make policy and pass laws and appeal to the Supreme Court is usually a stronger emotional case. So the upshot of that is, don't be buffaloed by saying, people saying, you're ignoring the science, you're denying the science, because the science is not on their side. It's not on ours either. It's still evolving. We don't know where it's going, but it hasn't demonstrated that people were born this way, that there's no choice involved in the way people express their sexuality, how they understand their gender. So this is worth looking at. Like I said, you can download it for free. It's worth taking a look at. So that's the first step with the science, is that the science is unclear, it's unsettled, it's still evolving. It doesn't provide a firm basis for saying we need to reorder love society. So don't be snookered by that line. And it is a reordering of society, because it's not news. Cultures have not tended to look at same-sex attraction as normative or even morally appropriate by and large. And certainly Western culture for the last couple of millennia have not. And that has been reflected in the medical literature, in the psychiatric literature. So they move into the next category on my handout, the diagnostic and statistical manuals of mental disorders. Some of you in your training may have done chaplaincy internships, or you may have encountered the DSMs somewhere along the line. This is the Bible of American psychiatry. And American psychiatry being American, it's got huge international implications as well. This began life 100 years ago as this. This was published in 1918, Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane. It's more a pamphlet than a book, and the diagnostic part of it is mostly sort of a glossary rather than a Bible of definitions. The DSM per se evolved the first one was published in 1952, and it's clear from the way homosexuality is described, sexual deviations, including homosexuality, are subsumed under sociopathic personality disturbance. And it's interesting to note in how far the culture has evolved since only 1952. It says, individuals to be placed in this category are ill primarily in terms of society and conformity with the prevailing cultural milieu. Do you imagine anybody saying that now, that you are diagnosably ill if you have trouble in conforming to the cultural milieu? No, we've turned that entirely around. Now the cultural milieu is responsible for being hospitable to us. It's changed entirely. It says, and not only in terms of personal discomfort and relations with other individuals. That last phrase is important because that has become the definition, the operational definition of mental disorder. Unlike orthopedics, where you can take an X-ray and see, there's the broken bone, or infectious disease, where you can do a laboratory study and say, identify, here's the infectious agent. There isn't really a gold standard for diagnosing a mental disorder, a psychiatric condition. Instead, what the DSM approach does is it says, if the person is experiencing subjective distress, or is encountering difficulties in their social and occupational functioning, then you can say, we've got a mental disturbance. Then we've got something we can treat. But there's no laboratory test, no diagnostic imaging, for the most part, a couple of exceptions. But for the most part, it's dependent on sort of checking off a series of boxes in the diagnosis. DSM-II, the second edition, published in 1968. Homosexuality is listed, it's a subcategory of sexual deviations. That's the technical term, sexual deviations. Again, the culture has changed. There was an evangelical Christian school of social work that had a course on deviant sexualities that included homosexuality, and their accreditation was immediately challenged by daring to suggest that homosexuality might be a deviation from some theoretical norm. I don't know how that has ever been settled, but that's the society is just turned upside down. It is a category for individuals whose sexual interests are directed primarily toward objects other than people of the opposite sex. And then I put the ellipsis because there's a bunch of other qualifications that apply. But again, the assumption is anything other than heterosexual sexual behavior is deviant. It deviates from what is normative. Again, we have changed from that, and the change comes in 1974. In just a later printing of DSM-II, the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, had their annual meeting in San Francisco in 1971, and their meeting was interrupted by demonstrations by the gay community, at least elements of the gay community in San Francisco, saying, we're not pathological. Take us out of your book. And so in the 1974 printing, took out homosexuality as a diagnosable entity. It's still, there is still a category for sexual orientation disturbance, but that's a step back. They've made a definitive step back from saying that this is a diagnosable disorder. And I'm not arguing whether it should be or not. I'm just tracing the emergence of the APA's thinking. So now we get to DSM-III in 1980, which they tried to waffle a little bit by distinguishing between ego-syntonic homosexuality and ego-dystonic homosexuality. Syntonic means I'm okay with it. Causes me no distress. I am happy living my life as a homosexual man or woman. Ego-dystonic is the opposite. It's like dystopia is the opposite of utopia. Dystonic is the opposite of syntonic. It causes me distress. I don't want these homosexual urges. I don't want this same-sex attraction. I want to stop behaving, interacting with the world as a homosexual. The essential feature, ego-dystonic homosexuality, the essential feature is a desire to acquire or increase heterosexual arousal so that heterosexual relationships can be initiated or maintained. Today, 37 years later, in the lifetime of most of us in the room, that will be considered reparative therapy and ethically forbidden, and in some places legally actionable as discrimination against homosexuals. The science behind that change in culture and policy, back to Mayer and McHugh, it's very slender, but it's a radical change. Also in DSM-3, gender identity disorder makes its first appearance. The essential feature, it says in DSM-3, of disorders in this subclass is an incongruence between anatomic sex and gender identity. Note that anatomic sex. That's taken as a given for nearly everybody. Gender identity is a sense of knowing to which sex one belongs. That is, an awareness that I'm a male or I'm a female. Gender identity is the private experience of gender role, and gender role is the public expression of gender identity. This is largely catalyzed by the experience of the sexual revolution, of the Stonewall Rebellion, and the emergence of gay liberation and feminism in the 70s, looking at gender roles and gender stereotypes and all that. This is coming out of that context. So there's no accident, by the way, that DSM-2, 1968, still diagnoses homosexuality, and that the sixth printing in 1974 changes that. What's happened between 1968 and 1974? The whole emergence, the sexual revolution, the emergence of the gay liberation movements, all these have happened just in that period of time. And the APA, stalwart representatives of the conformity to the moral order, caved. The scientists, the physicians, to my humble opinion, are not examining evidence and basing their diagnosis on the evidence, the science. They're responding to the cultural and political shifts. Yeah.
So kind of two questions. Have you experienced or noticed any other, I guess, previously considered or any other mental disorder, like, for example, like anorexia or anything like that, that has kind of had a similar kind of slide or kind of like breakdown or decay as far as their...
Not so much a slide. Some things like PTSD has evolved, starting from, like in World War I, calling it shell shock and stuff like that.
So kind of a developing understanding.
Yeah, and it's sort of
but not quite as radical as this.
Right. This is almost congruent with human development doctrine, and sort of developing the logical implications of the observed phenomenon.
Right.
Same thing with eating disorders. Again, there's more kind of observance, right, and nuance. Yeah. Yeah. I would add here. I didn't grow up Catholic, and as a Episcopal seminarian, never had any occasion to read Humanae Vitae, but in 2008, by then, Catholic, 40th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, I thought, well, you know, probably ought to read this. And so I did, and I was really impressed. Paul VI, I didn't really have much of an appreciation of before that. He was really got his finger on something here. Later on in the letter, he talks about the implications for society of the contraceptive mentality, and here it is. We'll hear more about that in a couple of minutes, the implications of the contraceptive mentality. So, but Paul VIII, Paul VI was really onto something here with Humanae Vitae. Although contraception is not the immediate issue with same-sex attraction, the anthropology behind it of understanding the function, the purpose of sexuality is implicit. So we'll come back to that. Gender identity disorders. DSM-3R. The JPII, there's a little bit of cynicism in the mental health professions that the APA keeps revising this because every few years they get to sell hundreds of thousands of copies. And this one, I forget what this was like $160. These are not cheap. The cover's running low. Let's send out another issue of the DSM. DSM-3R, the revised version of DSM-3. Even ego-dystonic homosexuality is gone. There is a note, you can still put it under, there's a catch-all category at the end of each diagnostic group of mood disorder, NOS, not otherwise specified. Psychotic disorder, NOS, not otherwise specified. And you could put it under sexual disorder, not otherwise specified. But any mention of homosexuality per se is gone at that point. DSM-4, 7 years later, homosexuality gone completely. And I put parenthetically, although it could conceivably be coded as a paraphilia not otherwise specified. Paraphilia is a sexual urge, fantasy behavior that has as its object something unusual, something perhaps inanimate. You could conceivably make a case for, say, someone of your same sex would be unusual, just statistically. But even after I wrote this in the file, I found myself rethinking it. I don't know if you really do that. I don't know. So homosexuality in DSM-4 is pretty much off the radar. Gender identity disorders move up, characterized by strong and persistent cross-gender identification accompanied by persistent discomfort with one's assigned sex. And that's pretty much how we understand the question today. Yeah.
As far as, once again, homosexuality being removed from the DSM, do psychologists who do still attempt to treat, with reparative therapy or something like that, are there professional consequences for differing from the APA?
That's still emerging. There are places, the professional associations have said this is not acceptable professional practice, and people have been brought up within the profession. What consequences have been, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But it's going to be honest.
Politically, yeah.
There are even jurisdictions where it's now illegal. So that, and I don't know of specific cases, but this is attaching professional and legal consequences to something on the basis of very slim scientific evidence. So yeah, this is thin ice material here. DSM-4 distinguishes gender identity disorder from physical intersex conditions. This comes up sometimes in discussions about gender identity. People say, well, there are cases where it's not clear biologically what a person's sex is, and there are. The DSM-4 mentions two of them: androgen insensitivity syndrome and congenital adrenal hyperplasia. I wish Steve Bruner were here. Where is he, by the way? Anyway. He's in Maryland. Back at school. androgen insensitivity syndrome affects developing male fetuses in utero. It's a congenital interference with the function of testosterone receptors in the cells of the emerging male fetus that he can't assimilate the testosterone, therefore doesn't develop the male secondary sexual characteristics. He is sterile and just visually, phenotypically, not readily identifiable as male. This is rare. It's like one case in hundreds of thousands. It's not a common situation at all. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia affects girls in utero. The adrenal hyperplasia, the adrenal gland regulates metabolic activity and endocrine activity in the body. And in female fetuses with that condition, the congenital adrenal hyperplasia, the adrenal glands are releasing more testosterone than normal. And so the emerging, the developing girl is affected by that in her sexual development. Again, not readily identifiable sometimes as a girl. Not to get graphic, I know we've got sensitive ears of the clergy here, but physically, visually, the difference between a clitoris and a penis in a fetus is not that great. And in a newborn, it's not necessarily that great. And so it becomes difficult, at birth, when people say, assigned female at birth, when the midwife or the obstetrician removes the baby and says, you have a little girl. In these cases, it's not easy to do that. But the point is, these are very rare cases. I said case one in hundreds of thousands.
Steve, real quick, even with that, I mean, still, like, in terms of the chromosomes that they have, chromosomes or female chromosomes, so like on the kind of most biological cell level, right?
Yeah, you're anticipating part of where we're going here. DSM-3 refers to anatomic sex. 2 words, there's the phrase on the page, anatomic sex. DSM-5, this monster, refers to biological indicators of male and female understood in the context of reproductive capacity, such as sex chromosomes, gonads, sex hormones, and non-ambiguous internal and external genitalia. Anatomic sex is going to this, turned into this big thing. So yeah, you're right. Even though the internal and external genitalia are ambiguous, the rest of it isn't. The chromosomes are not. Going back to DSM-4 and gender identity disorder, it says it specifies, it notes that the prevalence is rare. The epidemiological studies up until recent years, like recent meaning like 5 years, have said that the epidemiology of gender identity disorder is like 0.5% to 1%. This is like a small number of the population. And it goes on to say only a very small number of children with gender identity disorder will continue to have symptoms that meet the criteria in later adolescence or adulthood. That is to say, as we say it in popular culture, it's a phase, they'll outgrow it. Because most of the time it's a phase and they outgrow it. There is people who experience gender identity disorder in adolescence and adulthood, they're not going to outgrow it. That's by and large. For them, it's become a persistent, ongoing difficulty in reconciling their biological sex with their understanding of their own gender. So, 2013, this little thing, 1918, morphed by 2013, less than 100 years later, into this monster. DSM-5, this is currently the Bible in psychiatry, and the psychologists resent it, but they go by it too, and the clinical social workers, and pastoral psychotherapists, and nurse practitioners, the whole field. this is the book. Homosexuality is now completely off the table. We've gone from 1952, from homosexuality itself being diagnosable, to 2013, it's not even on the radar. But gender dysphoria now has its own whole chapter. And I started off mentioning that the ad hominem attacks these guys sustained. I didn't mention Lawrence Mayer considers himself, he says in the beginning of this, he says, I strongly support equality and oppose discrimination for the LGBT community, and I have testified on their behalf as a statistical expert. I dedicate my work on this report first to the LGBT community, which bears a disproportionate rate of mental health problems compared to the population as a whole. We must find ways to relieve their suffering. He considers himself, and has worked professionally, as one who is sympathetic to the LGBT community. He is not their enemy. But the politics of the thing are such that wander off the farm a bit and you become the enemy. A second example of that is the guy who headed up the committee that drafted the gender dysphoria chapter here. He's an American psychologist who has been working at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. He was head of their gender identity clinic for years and years, published frequently. He's one of the world's authorities on gender identity disorder. So the APA turned to him to head up their committee that revised his chapter. But in 2015, he published something. I'm trying to remember the details of this. He wavered on the party line about medical treatment and surgery for children and adolescents with gender identity disorder. He said instead we should be looking at their moderating their social and environmental environment and their ability to cope with that. We can hold off on the medical treatment and surgery until they're later in their development. And for that, he has been tarred and feathered, identified as the enemy, lost his position, lost his funding. The director, the chairman of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, issued an apology for not, my words, for not towing the line on the correct line on gender ideology. So this is fraught stuff. This is not easy stuff to publish, to get funded, to research, and to publish. Even if you're a researcher who is objective and scientific and wants to do the right thing, it's so politically charged that it's very difficult to do. So anyway, like I said, this now has its own chapter, and there it is for you. This whole first page, the second sentence here reads, the area of sex and gender is highly controversial and has led to a proliferation of terms whose meanings vary over time and within and between disciplines. Got that? You can never be sure what you're talking about and what your interlocutor is talking about because it varies over time and between and within disciplines. So when you have a discussion, a clinical discussion about gender identity disorder, you have to be simultaneously translating into what your interlocutor means by the terms that he or she is using. And the rest of this page, the whole page is definitions. Definitions of sex and sexual, and that's where the line about biological indicators understood in the context of reproductive capacity, sex chromosomes, gonads, sex hormones, non-ambiguous genitalia, etc. Definition, sex and sexual, cross-sex, gender, intersex, gender assignment, natal gender, gender atypical, gender nonconforming, gender reassignment, gender identity, gender dysphoria, transgender, transsexual. You have to know all these terms, and how this book uses them, and how your profession uses them, and how the institution where you work uses them, and how the other people from other professional disciplines on your staff use them, and how the person who wrote the article that you're reading that was written 8 years ago, how they used it. It's not easy to keep it all straight, so to speak. That is part of the challenge that confronts us. We're trying to deal with this. And the larger culture uses these terms, easily and interchangeably. And it's something we have to be, it's a minefield we have to be very careful about as we try to talk about this stuff. I want to underline a couple of things here. I mentioned humanae vitae, and they don't make a point of this, but it says here, biological indicators of male and female understood in the context of reproductive capacity. That is to say, reproductive capacity is not implicit, it's not an inherent characteristic of sexual or biological indicators of sex. What Pope Paul identified as the separation of reproduction as the cause, the end of sexual relations. Here it is. There it is on the page. It's not a necessary component of understanding sex. It's an independent thing. Biological indicators, that long list. That's just one set of indicators. There's other indicators. They are social, cultural, environmental, all kinds of other indicators that come into this. So even as late as DSM-3, 1980, saying there's anatomic sex, gender identity, even from there to this, things have changed remarkably. Biological indicators is just one among a set of indicators. And a key phrase, this is one that Paul McHugh would jump on. The last line of this first page here says the current term, gender dysphoria, not gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria. Current term is more descriptive than the previous term of gender identity disorder and focuses on dysphoria as the clinical problem, not identity per se. That is a huge sea change in how psychiatry understands itself, and it just slides in. Dysphoria is, euphoria is an elated, expansive mood. Dysphoria is the opposite of that. Dysphoria is a mood that you find unpleasant, undesirable. You're depressed, you're anxious, you're phobic, whatever. It's an emotional state that you don't want. It's a dysphoric state. There are other diagnostic categories to reflect dysphoric states. Mood disorders, anxiety disorders, these are by definition dysphoric states. There are other dysphoric states addressed in the DSM-3. But in those other ones, the dysphoria is treated by challenging the dysphoric cognitions. The treatment of choice for mood and anxiety disorders, for dysphoric conditions, is cognitive behavioral therapy, which may be augmented by psychopharmacology. It may be augmented by supportive or insight-oriented psychotherapy, but it's aimed at changing the thinking of the person who's experiencing the dysphoria. Gender identity dysphoria is the only dysphoria that is addressed with surgery. You don't address depression with surgery, or anxiety with surgery, or by pumping people up with sex hormones. This, like I said, is a sea change in psychiatry to say that this dysphoria, among others, needs to be treated by bringing reality into line with the cognitions of the person who is in your office. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the kind of trans-able movement, where people who are fully able but think that they should be disabled, so they'll actually like blind themselves or
Yeah.
like sever limbs?
Yeah, everybody heard this? Yeah, there are people who would say, my true identity of myself is as a paraplegic, so I want a surgeon to sever my spinal cord. Or my true understanding of myself is as an amputee, so I want a surgeon to cut off my hand. And surgeons appropriately say, hell no, go see a psychiatrist. But following your logic, that is starting to get some credibility. Yeah. But no, the larger population and the medical profession, by and large today, would still say, no, we're not going to cut off your arm.
I know, like the Johns Hopkins too, like they stopped doing gender reassignment because they noticed that it wasn't having any, didn't make any improvement.
And that was largely the work of Paul McHugh,
Yeah.
who, by the way, is a Catholic layman. He's a very interesting guy. He stands about this tall and has a pink complexion and is from Boston and sounds like he's from Boston. Like I said, I think he's a great man. He's on the advisory committee for the church about the sexual abuse crisis. Major guy. Okay, so the stage has changed entirely with the emergence of this book. And this reflects changes in the culture and in society, not changes or developments in the science. I keep coming back to that because when we talk as a policy matter about being based on the science, we're not based on the science. These changes are based on political and cultural, social considerations, not science. So, that brings us to Rome number 2, the church's official sources. And you may be familiar with some of these. I hope you're familiar with some of these. First one, from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1975, Declaration on Certain Questions Concerning Sexual Ethics. According to the objective moral order, homosexual relations are acts which lack an essential and indispensable finality. The end towards which sexuality was created. In sacred scripture, they're condemned as serious depravity. This judgment of scripture does not permit us to conclude that those who suffer from it are personally responsible, but it does attest to the fact that homosexualities are, and here's that phrase that people don't like to hear, intrinsically disordered and can in no case be approved of. That phrase comes up regularly, that it's just harsh. It falls hard on the ear to say that something or somebody is intrinsically disordered. In the second document, 1986, letter to the bishops of the Catholic Church on the pastoral care of homosexual persons, again from the CDF. This one released over the signature of Cardinal Ratzinger. How much of it he actually wrote, but I don't know. But it clearly was published with his approbation. And it says, it doesn't begin in the middle of the text. It says, to choose someone of the same sex for one's sexual activity is to annul the rich symbolism and meaning, not to mention the goals, of the Creator's sexual design. Homosexual activity is not a complementary union able to transmit life, and so it thwarts the call to a life that forms of self-giving, life of that form of self-giving, which the gospel says is the essence of Christian living. Here's the heart of the matter. It's not that homosexuals are awful people. Everyone in here knows some gay people. Maybe have members of your family who are gay, certainly members of your parish. Probably some of us in the room have same-sex attractions. It's not that they're horrible people. Not that they're necessarily perverts, not that they're pedophiles, not that they're cruising gay bars and back alleys doing the horrible things. No, they may be entirely respectable, perfectly fine people. But that the sexual activity that they're inclined to is at variance with the design of the Creator. There's the heart of the matter for us. It's a matter of the anthropology, the understanding of the human person. You know, I can imagine the snickering that comes up in a debate format, especially with a debate format with somebody outside of the church. If you start talking about the rich symbolism, because I can imagine the person saying, well, you know, if it's rich symbolism, the hell with it. You get your symbolism off my ovaries. You know, it's but that's what we have to offer. That's what we're about. Is the understanding revealed to us of the design of the Creator in creation. Because that's where our flourishing and our happiness and blessedness are to be found. It comes up here a couple of lines down. As in every moral disorder, homosexual activity prevents one's own fulfillment and happiness by acting contrary to the creative wisdom of God. That notion is one that our society does not understand. I mentioned to Michelle before we started. One of my sixth graders in our faith formation class asked me last spring, says, why can't gay people get married? Doesn't God want them to be happy? And this kid was not being obnoxious. She wasn't trying to, throw a gotcha question. That's the understanding in the cultural ambiance that she grew up in. God wants us to be happy. This set of people find their happiness with someone of their same sex. Why wouldn't God bless that? There I think is the underlying day in, day out challenge to us in teaching and pastoral work is to inculcate that understanding that our happiness is found in living within the design and will of the Creator. This is the message that is lost on lots of people, including lots of faithful, well-intended people in the church, and they need to hear it from us. Just as an aside, last spring when Karen Paschke made her act of consecration as a consecrated virgin, I took that opportunity to preach my one and only sermon so far about sex. And it was straight by the book, out of the catechism, but I had a couple of people upset. I had one mother in the aisle of the church with her 16-year-old daughter there saying, she's too young for this. No, she's not too young for this. In fact, it's a little late for her to be hearing this. But that's what we're dealing with. That's the challenge. In my parish work, I've had very little in the way of people with same-sex attraction coming to me, but this I encounter all the time. So I don't know what your experience is, but in my experience, this is where this is what we have to offer, and this is where the root of our disagreement with the broader culture is.
Steve, if I can.
Yeah.
So I think one of the challenges that I find, also having a little bit of training in all of this is that, even most of the people in our pews, once again, they don't really believe that there is Catholic anthropology or just human anthropology, that there is a given human nature.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, they would acknowledge there's a creator, but I think their understanding of what it means to be human is so much influenced by our secular culture, which says we get to reinvent ourselves or invent ourselves all the time over and over and over again. And so obviously you can see reflecting in the DSM here, because there is no norm, there is no standard, it just continues to shift with whatever is popular at the time, where obviously as John Paul II says, man fully revealed, or Christ fully reveals man to himself.
Yeah.
And so when we look to Christ, that's what we understand what it means to be human, and obviously our whole theological and human anthropological reflections kind of stem from that. But I think that really is the biggest challenge that I've found with people is they really don't, even our good Catholic people,
Right.
they have no understanding of our God-given human anthropology.
Yeah. Yeah, this mother who was complaining about, I preach about sex to her 16-year-old daughter, is one of our most active Christians. And in no way consider herself, on the cutting edge of theological change. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And given Father James Martin's recent book, this line from the 1986 letter to the bishops says, "Those within the church who argue that the church accepts the homosexual condition as though it were not disordered and to condone homosexual activity," hello, Father Martin, often have close ties with those with similar views outside of the church. Yeah, that's what Scott was saying. People who have bought or not even necessarily consciously bought, they have just absorbed the zeitgeist and the spirit of times. The church's ministers, this is again from the 1986 letter, the church's ministers must ensure that homosexual persons in their care will not be misled to that point of view about that homosexual condition is not disordered. So profoundly opposed to the teaching of the church. And I would extend that to say the church's ministers must ensure that all persons, especially as in children, as they're in formation, not be misled by that point of view. Moving on to the this letter, by the way, the 1986 letter, very much reflects. It's over Ratzinger's signature, and it's got John Paul's thumbprints all over it. It reflects his teaching and his theology of sex, the meaning of sex, sexual self-giving, spousal imagery of sexual union. It's shot through with that in this letter. John Paul's theology, written by Ratzinger, doesn't get much better than that. Third, the Catechism of the Catholic Church has 3 paragraphs specifically about homosexuality, and it pretty much recapitulates what the previous documents have said. But it says, the one thing that I do want to underline, it says, men and women who have homosexual tendencies must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Accepted, not tolerated. I put at the end some videos, including one by Father Mike Schmitz talking to a Steubenville conference to teenagers. And he starts, that's how he starts. He says, we are tolerant, we tolerate people other than us. He says, it's not about them, it's about us. We don't tolerate these people, we embrace them. It's about us. He's very good on this. So it must be accepted, not just tolerated, but embraced, with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. These people are called to fulfill God's will in their lives, and if they are Christians, unite with the sacrifice of the Lord's cross, the difficulties they may encounter from their condition. Respect, compassion, and sensitivity. I suspect most of us, and most of the church and most of the broader culture, are beyond the stage of ridiculing people with stereotypes and offensive slang terms and stuff like that. But we need to be vigilant about that in our own comportment, our own speech, and what we tolerate in the church context. Respect, compassion, sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination should be avoided. And finally, in 1997, USCCB's letter, Always Our Children, Pastoral Message to Parents of Homosexual Children and Suggestions for Pastoral Ministers. Let me turn the tape for a minute. USCCB documents, I frequently think, I sure hope this was written by a committee and that bishops just rubber stamped it, because this is really vacuous stuff. But this one is not bad. This one has some non-vacuous content. But notice that it's addressed to parents primarily, secondarily to ministers, with only a brief little bit at the end directed to people of same-sex attraction themselves. So it's about them, but not to them, right? For homosexual brothers and sisters, this is the very end of the document, we offer a concluding word. Though at times you may feel discouraged, hurt, or angry, do not walk away from your families, from the Christian community, from all those who love you. In you, God's love is revealed. You are always our children. It's not about them, it's about us, right? As Father Schmidt says in his video. The advice to church ministers, this reverts back to USCCP language. It's pretty predictable. It's unobjectionable. It's right. But it includes help to establish or promote support groups for parents and family members. We have, the Diocese has a phone number for our Madison Courage chapter, and phone calls to come to that get forwarded to me as attachments in an email. It's really very clever. But I realized, it took me a while to put it together, that I think I probably get more calls from parents and loved ones of homosexual people than I do from gay people themselves. And it sort of took me a while to realize, why not have like an Encourage chapter? Encourage is an offshoot from Courage. It's a support group for parents and loved ones of people of same-sex attraction. And I understand Michelle told me there's some talk that it would be desirable to form an Encourage chapter in the Diocese. I think it would be. I'd like to see that happen, because what happens is you get a lot of parents, relatives of homosexuals who have, discouraged by the church's teaching, unwilling to accept the church's teaching, have decamped, and these people are very upset about it, and they need support. That's a different task than what Courage is about. I'll come to Courage in a minute, but I would encourage that. I'd like to see that happen. Yeah, sorry, giving shots. That should happen, because there's a need for that ministry. Okay. So that brings me to Courage. As I began, that I was tasked with this developing Courage chapter from the very beginning of my priesthood ministry. Courage, the international apostolate of the Catholic Church, which ministers to persons with same-sex attractions. And it doesn't debate church teaching. The assumption is people who are engaged in Courage have embraced the church's teaching, want to live by the church's teaching, but have difficulties with it. And it's a peer support group. My job in Courage is mostly to be a chaplain, spiritual director, hear confessions, but the members themselves run the meetings. I don't run the meetings. It's a peer support group, kind of analogous to AA. It's not a 12-step program per se, but it's that emphasis on anonymity with outside of the group, and peer support within the group is the hallmark of it. The goals here, these I just cut and paste from the Courage website. 5 goals created by the members of Courage themselves. To live chaste lives in accordance with the Church's teaching on homosexuality. To dedicate our entire lives to Christ through a long list of spiritual disciplines that will behoove any Christian to follow. To foster a spirit of fellowship in which we may share with one another our thoughts and experiences, and ensure that no one will have to face the problems of homosexuality alone. When I mentioned Courage at Chula Vista a couple of years ago, a couple of people commented on that language about problems of homosexuality. Oh, my gay brother would not, he would sort of bridle with that. Well, I didn't make up the language. This is Courage members themselves drafted this document. I'm just quoting what they wrote. It's the same thing with that intrinsically disordered lines that some people just don't want to hear. Yeah.
As far as the language used in dealing with these topics, do you find it at all helpful to refer to like, people with same-sex attraction as opposed to just identifying them as homosexuals or gays?
Yeah.
Is there much there in your mind?
Well, yes, there is. That's
what
Father
language
Cech,
for.
who's
Yeah.
recently left as the director of Courage, was very strong on not using the word gay because that sort of buys into the broader cultural term.
The defining characteristic of them is their sexual orientation.
Yeah. So I take the theoretical point, but it's just a mouthful to say every time. You know, same-sex attraction, just as many more syllables than gay. You know, so I mean, he's right. I mean, I get the point. But again, that's an example of how we have to be careful about the language. We have to use the language consciously, intentionally, and carefully. So, yeah, I use the word gay. Our group uses the word gay. You know, but what we're looking at is what they're looking for support with is their same-sex attraction. Two of the members of our group are still identify as gay men and with same-sex attraction, but who are married heterosexually and have families. But they persistently deal with the attractions that are ego-dystonic. They want to support the group in managing sort of ahead with their family lives or spiritual lives. Fourth goal of Courage, to be mindful of the truth that chaste friendships are not only possible but necessary in a chaste Christian life. That's one that, in a room full of vowed celibates, it's one that all of us can identify with too. But again, this flies in the face of the prevailing culture. Chastity is not something we're sentenced to or condemned to. It's where we find our fulfillment and our joy. And we need to be careful about how we present chastity in our parishes, with the Faith Commission kids, marriage preparation, and all of that. It's not a dirty word. It's not something to be avoided if at all possible. This is the John Paul heritage as well. Everybody is called to a chaste life. Even people in active heterosexual marriages are called to live out their marriage chastely. The form, for those of us who have celibacy, is something else. The form of that for people with same-sex attraction is a different form. But we need to be clear, chastity is not a bad thing. We're looking for chastity. We like chastity. We approve of chastity. We embrace it. It's where we find our happiness and our fulfillment. So just set the photo came off. If anybody has something to discuss. On the last page, I have videos worth watching. I list 3 of them. The first one, the third way homosexuality in the Catholic Church is a number. It's a sort of linked together a series of interviews with a number of faithful Catholics with same-sex attraction, talking about their histories and how they have grown into their understanding and apprehension of faith. It's 38 minutes. It's worth watching. The second one, Mike Schmidt's Love and Same-Sex Attraction. Like I said, it's a Steubenville presentation. That one is about 50 minutes. He's really very good. These are both worth watching. Both there may be uses for both of them in parish work and faith formation work. They're suitable for that. The Desire of the Everlasting Hills is longer. That's on the order of a feature-length film, 2 hours, and it's 3 Courage members, again in much greater detail. That's also worth watching, but that's a bigger chunk of your time than the first 2. I recommend those first 2 very highly. The third one also, but the first 2 are easier to get at. And one of the things to get at, when I asked our local group what I should be sure to say in this presentation, one of the things that came up was had to do with that line from the USCCB letter accepting people. There was a guy who commented that in his parish, the people who bring up the gifts at the offertory are usually, in his parish, the default setting is that it's a married couple and often with their kids, because it's just adorable. It's my editorial comment, because it's adorable when kids bring the offerings up. But what about us single people? We never get asked to bring the offerings up. And it's something I never even entered my mind to think about, because that's the sort of thing that the ushers grab somebody close to them at the back of the church when it's time to bring the offerings up, or some liturgical minister or scheduler puts people in some kind of rotation. I never gave it a thought. But he did. It stuck out at him. He noticed it, and I don't think it was a grave wound to him, but it was enough of a wound that he brought it up. Just a thought that I leave for you. The same guy also, one of these non-gay calls I got to the Courage number was a choir member of one of our parishes who has a gay friend, alienated Catholic because of the church's teaching on homosexuality, and she wants to invite him to come back to church, but she's afraid to because that the preacher, the pastor of the church, sometimes is what she seems to feel is a little overstrident about sexual matters. So I brought this to our group and said, how should I respond to this lady? They were clear. The guy she's talking about, her friend, isn't ready to come back to church yet. She shouldn't invite him. He's not there. He can't hear it. And his point was, this is what we have to offer. This is not something we apologize for. This is what we're about. This guy, by the way, is who is a convert. He was received into the Catholic Church a year or so ago. And he read himself into Catholicism by reading about sexuality issues and about Christian anthropology. He said that the Catholic Church has done it. That's the true understanding of the human person and sexuality. He read himself into the church because of that. He's got a good point. This is what we have to offer. We have an understanding of the human person based on revelation, but also based on experience. That this is where our happiness is found. And so we don't debate it, encourage. And it's a sort of discussion you might readily have, but it's not something to bludgeon people with. It's something to entice people with. Here's a coherent view of meaning and understanding and purpose in existence. That's a profound existential thing to offer. Anyway, that's all I have. Monsignor, questions, discussion?
Any questions for Father Steve?
Yes.
Yes.
I was hoping that you could say a little bit more about the group experience with it. I mean, things as simple as how many people have been participating over time, and what's the attrition rate, so to speak.
Yeah.
And what could somebody expect if they come to
Yeah.
one of the meetings? Those kind of things.
It is a small group. We have 3 regulars, and then we have a larger number of sort of occasional droppers in who don't come regularly, and then we have a larger number of people who come once or twice and decide, not for me. One of our members is from Chicago, where there are 2 or 3 courage groups, and she tells us that even in a huge city like Chicago, none of their 2 or 3 groups is very big. None of their 2 or 3 groups is much bigger than ours, but there are 2 or 3 of them. But interestingly, she says they each have a different flavor. They approach their task differently. And I'm still enough of a newbie that I don't have a very well-developed sense of what alternatives takes on what the courage chapter is like.
Do they gotta be at a certain point before it makes sense for them to start participating?
Well, Not necessarily. We have one of our occasional droppers in is still wavers between her lesbian life and her Catholic life. And so she sort of ebbs and flows. So, you know, it's not necessarily that one is, you know, resolutely committed, you know, to this aspect of the church's teaching, but she's evolving, she's developing, and so if we can be supportive in her, through her, in that process, we can do that. But we don't really debate stuff. You know, it's not.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I feel like I've kind of hit a wall with the numbers. It's been difficult to develop beyond our hardcore nucleus. So.
I know that Courage, if you go onto their international site, they do offer materials that if you would like, we've had a couple calls like in our office, because we used to Eric used to be in our office and he was responsible to forward the Courage calls. So we've gotten often calls, and I went onto their website one day and found that there are materials that you can keep either in your confessional or in the vestibule of your church. Do you have some of those?
I do, and I distributed those at Chula Vista a year
Oh,
or two
okay.
ago.
Okay, but I know if you go on their website and call them, they will send you materials to keep,
Yeah.
particularly in, you know, because we had a priest call us and say, I want stuff for the confessional when I'm talking with people, stuff like that. So I know they're very open to
Yeah.
giving
Yeah,
materials.
we have that stuff.
Okay,
In fact, that may be some of the stuff that I inherited from Eric.
yes,
I've
yes,
got
we had
those in my-
boxes.
I've got a couple boxes of those in my garage.
Oh, good.
So, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So you spoke a great deal about how the scientific disciplines, the DSM, has characterized and categorized different people over time and the different language that they've used and how it's changed. How do we speak about people in these various situations? Do we try to categorize at all? Do we try to avoid categorization? If we do, yeah, what do we do? And also because we desire to have, to have names for things. And so people often struggle like, well, if I'm not this and I'm not that, then where am I?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have a really good answer to it. I try as much as possible to use the language that the person uses. But part of the downside of being identified as the Courage guy in the diocese is that Father Tate called me a couple of years ago and said, we've met a guy through the tribunal that he's got some marriage issues related to same-sex marriage and gender identity. Could you meet with him? For confidentiality, I won't get more graphic than that, but it's like, I met with this guy, and it's like, where do we even begin? How do I even find, what name do I address this guy by? Like I said, my default setting is to use as much as I can without being dishonest. Use language that the person is using. I try not to categorize people beyond where they categorize themselves. A lot of people are perfectly candid that my sexual attractions are homosexual. So again, that question like gay or same-sex attracted, again, with not infinite flexibility, but trying to find the flexibility I can to use the language.
And then going beyond the terminological matter, but just sort of like, where in our anthropology do people fit in? And how do we describe that? It's just like, okay, so you're not, like, statistically speaking, you're not the most common, manifestation, but, you're not, are you diseased or are you disordered? Are you this, are you that?
Yeah.
And, you don't like a lot of these terms, but we do want something, and we don't want to say you're perfectly normal and okay and you should just do whatever your impulses tell you to do, because we don't want anybody to do that. We want to guide our impulses towards virtue.
Yeah, the specific content of intrinsically disordered is important. This is, and it goes on to say, and can in no way be approved. That this becomes a pastoral challenge, how to find a pastorally useful way to say the attraction that you're experiencing is in itself at odds with the creator's design and creation. That's a hard thing to say usefully and a hard thing to hear. But that's why you make the big bucks as pastor.
He's not pastor. Yeah.
That's, you can weasel out your way that as a pastoral associate. Yeah, no, the language question, it pervades this, all these things, and it's a minefield. You have to be very careful.
Along those lines, actually, I heard an excellent talk this summer by a Dominican from Washington, D.C., who he's done a lot of research on transgenderism. And when he gave a talk, he said that he's found that when he's working with people, you kind of, once again, want to meet them where they're at, but obviously with always a view to trying to help them find greater healing and wholeness. So he said, and this is obviously not quite the same thing as same-sex attraction, but he said with them, like, he worked with this gentleman, the whole reason the issue was brought up, he's walking into a Walgreens one day, some guy came up to him and said, "Are you a Catholic priest?" You know, he's dressed as a Dominican. Yeah. What can I help you with? Well, I'm Catholic and I just got kicked out of my parish last week. I need to talk to somebody. So what happened is this man had been married for like 25 years. All his children had moved out of the house now. And he decided it was time for him to transition to becoming a woman. And so he showed up at Mass one weekend dressed, you know, as a woman. And the pastor who had seen him for decades was like, "What are you doing? There are all these kids here and everything. You can't do this, kid." So this guy was all disturbed because he really does want some desire to be connected to the church, but he also, you know, had this desire to kind of identify as a woman. And so this Dominican priest was saying, like, in the context of talking with this guy, what he ended up finding, and then his research and looking at the church's tradition and all that, his suggestion, I just throw it out there, I thought it was at least interesting. He said that in private conversations with that person, if simply referring to them in the language that they want to use is helpful, that you can do the more important work of helping them begin to find some healing and stuff like that. He was willing to do that kind of privately. But then obviously in a public setting and everything, because of wanting to kind of uphold objective values and kind of, once again, an objective human anthropology and everything, then he would kind of use the church's very specific anthropological language. But he didn't want that to get into a barrier in terms of like the one-on-one private conversations with the individual, because if he started using those words with that person in the conversation all the time and it's just such a barrier, then that person would just shut down and they would not be able to continue to do the further work of advancing that person's healing and wholeness. So I thought that was kind of a good balance, personally.
Yeah, I wasn't in that nice
Yeah,
situation. Finding the useful way, find the language that the guy can hear and respond to usefully when it's difficult.
I know there's a large push in society to completely normalize, if you will, gender identity issues and gender dysphoria, whatever you want to call it. Do you, this is kind of asking you to predict the future, but do you foresee the gender identity stuff going the same way in the business, if you will, in psychology, as same-sex issues did? Do you see it becoming, you know, in DSM-6?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is very much in flux. That chapter in DSM-5, I can guarantee, will look quite a bit different in DSM-6. In what ways will be different? I don't know. I would hope that the broader culture's thinking about gender identity settles down a little bit. You start hearing about parents of grade school children who go, "Well, my little girl likes to play with trucks, so she's actually a transgendered boy, and we want to affirm her in her identity." And it's like, well, you know, no, it's right. It's possible for a girl to be a tomboy and nobody to be confused that she's a girl. In fact, for her not to be confused that she's a girl. And 10 years from now, she's a good chance she's not going to be a tomboy anymore, you know. So I hope the larger culture settles down. But where the profession is going to go, yeah, I suspect it'll probably be normalized the way homosexuality has been. But who knows? I've been surprised before. Yeah.
I mean, but to a certain extent, that kind of thinking does tend to cannibalize itself. For example, I know with like transgenderism, where, once again, biology doesn't matter, and like radical feminism, where biology does matter, they tend to like kind of cannibalize themselves as far as like, no, these, what it means to be a woman is either biological or it's not.
Yeah, I didn't go into it, in that page of definitions, there's a lot of ambiguity and some logical inconsistency that, that will have to be sorted out over time. But yeah, that's a good example, where the,
It's untenable.
one branch of feminist thought says this, the other branch says that, and it's like, well, frying pan fire, you know, which is.
Which one are you transphobic? You know?
Yeah, right. That question actually, the LGBT thing, there's a component of the gay community that says, wait a minute, that T part, we sympathize with those people, but that's not us. That's their own set of issues. We shouldn't be lumped in with them. They've got their own set of issues, they're not us. And then obviously the LGBT, as you just said, didn't stand on its own because there was now then those who were genderqueer and those who were questioning and those who were this and there were those who were that, so it now goes on. So the language, the whole, it's all so up in the air that yeah, I gotta settle it, I hope.
I have a question for you or for anyone else in the room, but you know, practically, when you have somebody in the parish who, like, let's say they have a child who identifies as same-sex attraction and is kind of living that lifestyle, you know, and they're Catholic, and there's that part of them that says, well, okay, I know this isn't right, but I just want my child to be happy. And you hear that all the time. Like, how have you found it's best to work with those people in the parish?
Well, I have a former colleague from my old psychiatric clinic in Connecticut, who was a cradle Catholic, and she and I were tight. And when I came into the Catholic Church, she said, oh, I hope you get better catechesis than I got. She said, our catechesis was making felt banners and going to see the movie Oh God. So she was tuned in on that level, and she would never, she's Irish Catholic, and aunt was a nun, you know, the whole 9 yards, Catholic school, the whole bit. She's also an out and proud lesbian. And she knows that I buy into the church's teaching about that, and we just sort of bracket that question, and we don't go there very often. Occasionally, one or the other will say something outrageous enough that the other will respond to, but we basically bracket it. Where that question comes up, I meant to mention this earlier, it has not been unusual that somebody says, I got invited to a same-sex wedding. Can I, in a clear conscience, go to that? And Monsignor, I look forward to your advice on that. I haven't had a real good answer to that question. Marriage is a public act, as Monsignor has had his feet held to the fire about over the last couple of weeks. And so if you're there supporting this couple in a public act, I wish I had a better answer, but that's something that I bet a lot of people in the room here have encountered. Yeah, and that's calls on your finely honed pastoral sensibilities there.
They're only moderately honed, but I'm working on it.
I'm eating up your time. You want to?
Any more, I want to give priority to Father Steve, so if there's any questions or further comments, I want to emphasize the good pastoral work, both of courage and with Father Steve's expertise, so.
Have you seen a video by Father Scalia?
I saw a reference to it the other day, and I haven't seen it.
I think it's really good. I've seen it. It's a little bit long,
Yeah.
but it's to young kids and things, probably high schoolers.
Okay.
And but it explains all the the anthropology and
Yeah.
it's really I like it. And I use this to explain this to my confirmation class.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. No, I only saw reference to that the other day for the first time, and I think highly of him, so I would expect it to be good, but I haven't seen it myself.
It's good because I think same-sex attraction by Scalia, you'll find it if you do. It's really good.
On YouTube.
Yeah, you do, it's there.
Good. All right.